Well, thank you very much for being with us in this edition of Tu Comunidad. Today we have a very special guest, Ms. Takesha Red. She's Assistant City Attorney for the City of Winston-Salem. Ms. Red, Takesha, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Today we're going to talk about a very special issue as well. And it's about a new, let's say, enhanced protection that the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development started recently. And they added it to the sex category because now sexual orientation and gender identity will be, I mean, if somebody claims that he or she is being discriminated under housing, under those two categories, we will have to investigate the complaint. But I don't want to, talk ahead of myself. This is why we have the expert here with us, Ms. Takesha Red. So please tell us a little bit about what you do in the city of Winston-Salem, and then if you can briefly explain to the public what is the Fair Housing Act and how people are protected.
Okay, well, my name is Takesha Red. I am an assistant city attorney for the city of Winston-Salem. I work over at City Hall, and I am assigned to advise the Human Relations Department in addition to some other departments for the city of Winston-Salem. So I provide legal advice and counsel and provide legal work for the city.
Wonderful. So for those who don't understand, the Fair Housing Act can be a lot of things, but what is in general, how can we summarize the Fair Housing Act for those who are not familiar with it, Ms. Red?
Okay, so the Fair Housing Act is a federal law that was passed and signed in 1968 by President Lyndon Baines Johnson. And it is, or I guess you could say it was, along the lines of civil rights legislation, pieces of civil rights legislation that were passed. This one was passed after Martin Luther King Jr. passed away because housing was something that he was very passionate about, and it was one of the causes that he was championing prior to his assassination. But the Fair Housing Act, just kind of very briefly, prohibits discrimination regarding the sale or renting or financing of housing on the basis of race, religion, color, national origin, sex. Previously it said handicap, but now we refer to it as disability and familial status.
Wonderful. So let's start delving into the subject. So recently, HUD, under the authority that they have over the Fair Housing Act, told all of the fair housing assistance programs, like the city of Winston-Salem, that if someone files a fair housing complaint claiming that they were discriminated under sexual orientation or gender identity, we would have to investigate the complaint. What does this mean for the public that's listening to us, Ms. Red?
Okay. So under previous version or previous interpretations of the Fair Housing Act, the term sex or sex discrimination referred strictly to biological sex you were assigned at birth. So say if someone decided they didn't want any women living in their rental properties, or if they did not want to sell a house to a single man, that is the traditional interpretation of sex discrimination. However, there was a recent the definition, as with any legal things, they evolve over time. And there were various pieces of, federal legislation, federal guidance that kind of broadened the category of sex and to include sexual orientation and gender identity. And last year, 2020, there was a Supreme Court case that was decided, and it was decided, if I'm not mistaken, in Title VII, which is employment. But under the holding of that case, the Supreme Court held in a 6-3 decision that you could not consider sex without including sexual orientation and gender identity, because the very nature of those things, they're all connected. So if you say that, if someone was trying to fire an employee for being married to a person of the same sex, well, that only becomes an issue if you say, well, if a woman did it, it would be fine. But if a man married another man, it wouldn't be fine. Well, that is treating someone differently on the basis of sex. So after the Supreme Court passed that or issued that decision at the federal level, President Biden signed an executive order asking all federal agencies to examine their existing policies to see where they needed to clarify how gender identity and sexual orientation would be handled. And H.U.D issued, I think, a decision, it was maybe about 2 weeks ago, back in mid-February, saying explicitly, because there were ways to go about it, but it wasn't explicit. But so the guidance issued about 2 weeks ago explicitly states that now sexual orientation and gender identity are included in the definition of how we view sex discrimination under the Fair Housing Act.
I see. So let's try to guide the public in this. Can we try to explain what gender identity means and what sexual orientation means in simple terms, if that is possible, or at least for the purposes of what we're talking about, which is the Fair Housing Act?
Yes. So I guess the most basic or basic definition of sexual orientation that I give you, it is to whom a person is attracted. And so some people are attracted to people of the same sex. Some people are attracted to people of opposite sex. Some people are attracted to people of both sexes. So that's just kind of at its very basic definition, what sexual orientation is.
How about gender identity?
Okay, so gender identity is at its kind of basic definition, how a person sees themselves or himself, herself, or their self as it relates to or not relates to the biological sex they were defined or assigned at birth. So you could have a person who their gender identity and their biological sex match, or you could have a person whose gender identity and biological sex does not match.
I understand. Okay, it can get very complicated, probably.
It can.
But those are the basics.
Those
Okay.
are the basics.
Now, how are we? So the question, I guess, the next question will be, how does this new interpretation would apply? Is the law changing, for instance, does it apply to all landlords or only to some landlords, or how do we can we explain the public how this new drive or this for HUD will work?
So basically, it will cover into any entity previously covered by the Fair Housing Act. So that could be a landlord, it could be a mortgage company, it could be an appraiser, it could be anyone, a realtor, it could be anyone covered under the Fair Housing Act. Now, there are some exceptions. So depending on the type of property being rented or the size, there are some landlords in very limited situations where they are not covered by the Fair Housing Act. And so if they are not covered by the Fair Housing Act in any instance, then of course this would not make those landlords be covered. But for the most part, you know, if you're a covered entity, then it applies to you.
I see. So these are there are no new requirements in a way, right? There's no how to say that? I mean, no new people covered, correct? Right. I mean, it's basically the same, except these two categories will not have to be investigated under sex, correct?
That is correct.
Now, okay, thank you. Now, here locally, can you please explain the public who enforces the Fair Housing Act locally, and what a tenant should do if they believe that he or she has been discriminated under these new I don't want to call them categories, but these two.
We'll just say this broadened category.
Oh, right, there you go. There you go. So they believe that they have been discriminated in a housing transaction under their sexual orientation or their gender identity. How do they go about it?
So the city of Winston-Salem has, and I think you alluded to it earlier, a FAP, which is a Fair Housing Assistance Program. And what a Fair Housing Assistance Program is, it is an agency that administers fair housing laws within that jurisdiction that has been determined by HUD to have substantially similar local ordinances, laws, substantially similar to the Federal Fair Housing Act. And so the city of Winston-Salem is a FAP, and that that investigation and enforcement duty is assigned to the Winston-Salem Human Relations Department. Now, if a tenant believes that they have received discriminatory treatment, then by all means, they can contact the City of Winston-Salem's Human Relations Department to file a complaint. They can do so by going to the city's website and looking up the information for how to do that. They can call 311. Prior to COVID, they could come down to City Hall to do so, but we have reduced hours to the public because of the COVID protection and stay-at-home orders that are in place. But that is the entity who is responsible for investigating, so they would need to contact the Human Relations Department to file that complaint.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Reid. Now, and just to finish the conversation, thank you very much for your time and your knowledge on this important matter. And the last question I would have for you is, this is very new, right? We really don't know what is going to happen on the field once this is, I mean, now that this is possible. But what type of defense do you anticipate from some landlords that will say, no, I didn't do it, or I did? Is there something that we can tell the public, hey, yeah, if they say that, it's still, don't worry, it's still, or could still be a potential discriminatory act against you?
Well, as with any new or broadened category of legislation, I like to refer to the law as the skeleton. And then case law is kind of the muscle and the skin. So you have this framework, but the framework can't imagine every single real world scenario. And sometimes there are cases of first impression, or cases where the facts are kind of the same, but there's one or two little differences that determine how a court would decide what to do in that situation. And so if the person believes that they have been discriminated against, they should not allow the fact that this is a new area of the law, or a new, I'm sorry, not a new area, a new application of the law to deter them from filing their complaint. They should still do that, but know that because this is a new application of the law, the case law has to build. And so it's on paper what it says, but now it will be up to the courts to determine what that means and how we apply that. But it certainly should not be a deterrent, because at the very core of it, it is an anti-discrimination piece of legislation designed to eliminate, discriminatory treatment in housing. And so if someone feels that they have been discriminated against, it is best to not worry about what could happen, but to file the complaint and let the process play out.
Oh, wonderful. That's a great suggestion, Ms. Reid. Don't deter yourself, right?
That is correct.
The possibilities or how is this going to be interpreted. Just file a complaint and let the process play out.
Yes, sir.
Wonderful. Well, folks, just to summarize, H.U.D issued a new guidance for all the FAP offices in all the United States, right, of America.
Correct.
And now, if there is an allegation of discrimination under sexual orientation or gender identity, we have to investigate the complaint and try to substantiate the allegation. Is there something that we didn't touch, Ms. Reid, that you would like to add for our audience?
No, I mean, not that I can think of. If they have any questions, they can feel free. I think there are some resources available on the city's website. Additionally, there are resources available that kind of break this down on HUD's website. So, there are resources available to kind of give a more detailed explanation of some of these concepts. But ultimately, again, if they're unsure, they can reach out to the city's Human Relations Department, and either we could get them the information or try to answer that question for them if they need to know whether or not they've been discriminated against. That is something we can certainly answer.
Correct. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for your knowledge and your time. This was Takesha Reid. She is the Assistant City Attorney of the City of Winston-Salem. Thank you very much for your time. And thank you very much for those who are at home listening or watching. Thank you very much for your attention. And remember, the summary is, if you believe you or someone you know have been discriminated based on their sexual orientation or gender identity, on a housing transaction, and you heard what a housing transaction is. It can be rent, buy, appraisals. It can be a realtor, right? It can be financing, any of that. Please contact the city of Winston-Salem, and we will try to investigate the complaint. Thank you again very much, Ms. Reyes, for your time and the information. And thank you all for being with us in this edition of Tu Comunidad.
Thank you. My pleasure.